There are questions that systems decide to stop asking, not because they've been answered, not because they've been resolved, but because at some point, continuing to ask them creates more problems than it solves. And when that moment comes, the system does something very specific. It closes the door, quietly, deliberately, and then it moves on. That's exactly what happened in 1969. After more than 2 decades of investigation, thousands of reports, and one final scientific review, the United States government reached a conclusion. UFOs did not represent a threat. They did not require further investigation, and they did not belong within serious scientific inquiry. That decision was reinforced by the scientific community, accepted by institutions, and absorbed into the culture. And just like that, the question disappeared. Not from the sky, but from the system. Because the sky didn't change, the observations didn't stop, and whatever people were seeing didn't go away. So tonight, we're not asking what are UFOs, we're asking something far more important. Why did the system come back to this question after decades of silence? Because systems don't reopen questions lightly, and when they do, it means something has changed. Welcome back to UFO to UAP The Disclosure Report. I'm your host, Matt Tones. Today's episode is titled Why UAP Research Returned, the Pentagon, AARO, and the New Question. Please subscribe, please share this episode. It really does help us in an enormous way. After the closure of Project Blue Book and the release of the Condon Report, a new phase began, a phase defined by absence. No major programs, no structured investigation, no meaningful scientific engagement. The official position was clear. UFOs were not a threat, not scientifically valuable, and not worthy of continued attention. And for decades, that position held. But here's the critical detail. The absence of investigation is not the absence of phenomenon. Because while the system stopped looking, the reports never stopped. Pilots continued to report objects they couldn't identify. Military personnel logged encounters. Civilians described lights and movements that didn't match known behavior. And inside the system, these reports were not ignored. They were contained, filed, observed, discussed in limited circles, but without a formal framework. They couldn't be escalated, because escalation requires structure, and structure had been removed. So the system existed in a strange state, receiving data without the authority to act on it, and that created tension. While the conversation remained quiet, something else was happening. The system itself was changing, not in policy, not in position, but in capability. The tools used to observe the world were evolving. In earlier decades, observation was limited. A pilot sees something, a radar picks up a signal, but those observations were isolated, difficult to verify, easy to dismiss. But by the early 2000s, all that changed. Now, observation became multi-layered. An object could be tracked by radar, captured on infrared, and confirmed by multiple systems at the same time. And this created a new reality. Now, when something appeared, it wasn't just seen, it was recorded, measured. And once something is measured, it becomes much harder to ignore. This is where the silence begins to break. In the early 2000s, US Navy pilots began reporting encounters, objects that moved without visible propulsion, accelerated in ways that define known limits, and operated in controlled airspace. These were not isolated incidents. They were repeated, consistent, and crucially, they were captured on advanced systems. This is where everything changes, because now the system is no longer dealing with stories, it is dealing with data. At this point, something shifts. The question changes. It is no longer, what are these objects? It becomes, do these objects represent a threat? And that shift is everything, because curiosity can be ignored, threats cannot. Systems are not built to satisfy curiosity. They're built to manage risk. And once something is framed as risk, the system is forced to respond, even if it does not understand what it is seeing. So the system does what it always does. It re-engages quietly, without announcement, without attention. The Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program is created, small, controlled, and limited in scope. Its purpose is not disclosure. Its purpose is analysis, to examine anomalous aerial phenomena through the lens of national security. This is the first time since the closure of Blue Book that the system formally reopens a question, but it does so carefully, not under the label of UFOs, but under something far more acceptable: aerospace threat. Once AATIP begins its work, something familiar starts to emerge. Not clarity, not resolution, a pattern. Most cases can be explained: misidentifications, environmental effects, sensor anomalies, but some cannot, and that alone is not unusual. Every complex system produces noise. Every data set contains outliers. But here's the difference. These outliers are not isolated. They are repeated, observed across multiple platforms, and consistent in their behavior, which means the system is now facing something it hasn't before. Not a single unexplained event, but a persistent category of the unexplained. And when something becomes persistent, it becomes a problem. At first, anomalies are tolerated. They are expected. But patterns are different. Patterns suggest structure, and structure implies something real is happening, even if it is not understood. As these patterns became clearer, they begin to move upward, from analysis to command structures, from isolated reports to aggregated concern. And this is where the system starts to shift again, because once something reaches this level, it is no longer just an observation problem, it becomes an intelligence problem. AATIP is no longer enough. It was designed as a small exploratory program, but the scale of the issue is growing, so the system evolves. It creates something more structured, the UAP Task Force. And this is a significant step because it signals commitment, not full commitment, but enough to say this is now a recognized category of concern. The task force begins to standardize how reports are collected, centralize analysis, and track patterns across the system. This is no longer about isolated events. This is about system-level awareness. At this point, the terminology itself begins to change. UFO becomes UAP. unidentified aerial phenomena. This is not cosmetic, it is strategic, because the term UFO carries stigma, assumptions, and cultural baggage. But UAP is neutral, clinical, analytical. It allows the system to engage with the problem without inheriting the narrative. Now, something unusual happens. The system begins to move out of the shadows, not completely, but enough to be noticed. Footage captured by Navy pilots is released. The Pentagon becomes visible. Videos showing objects that move in ways that defy conventional understanding, lack visible propulsion, and interact with military systems. And for the first time in decades, the Pentagon acknowledges something publicly. Not that these objects are extraterrestrial, not that they are advanced technology, but something far more precise. They are real and they are unexplained. This is where we need to slow down because this moment is often misunderstood. This is not full disclosure, it is controlled visibility. The system is choosing what to release, how to frame it, and when to present it. Because uncontrolled information creates instability, but controlled information creates narrative. Once the footage is released, the public responds immediately. Headlines spread, Pentagon confirms UFOs, unknown objects tracked by Navy pilots, and the narrative expands rapidly. But here's the critical distinction. The public sees mystery, the system sees data it cannot yet resolve. And that gap between perception and process is where most confusion lives. Now we reach the most important structural shift, the creation of the All-domain Anomaly Resolution Office. I'll say that again. The All-domain Anomaly Resolution Office, known as AARO, which is AARO. This is not a temporary program. It is not experimental. It is institutionalized. AARO is designed to collect reports across all domains, analyze patterns, and provide ongoing assessment. Air, sea, space, and beyond. This is the full return of the system, but under a completely different framework. Not what are these objects, but do these phenomena represent a threat we cannot identify? And that is the modern UAP question. At this point, we need to step back because the return of UAP research was not a decision made out of curiosity. It wasn't driven by belief, and it wasn't a reversal of past conclusions. It was something much simpler. The system ran out of options because the data didn't stop, the observations didn't slow down, and the technology continued to improve, which meant one thing. The system was now seeing more, not less. In earlier decades, anomaly could be ignored. It could be dismissed, written off as misidentification or instrument error or human perception. But now the scale has changed. The system is no longer dealing with isolated events. It is dealing with continuous detection. And that creates a new problem because at scale, anomalies stop being exceptions, they become categories. And once something becomes a category, it demands structure. This is the most important transformation in the entire story, the shift from curiosity to risk, because curiosity is optional. You can ignore it, you can dismiss it, you can walk away from it. But risk is different. Risk demands attention, risk demands response, and the system is not built to explore curiosity, it is built to manage risk. So the question is no longer, what are we seeing? It becomes, does this matter? This is why language matters, because language defines how a problem is understood and how it is handled. UFO is a cultural term. It carries with it assumptions, associations, and decades of narrative. But UAP is something else entirely. It is neutral, analytical, controllable. It allows the system to engage without committing to a conclusion. It allows investigation without reopening stigma. And most importantly, it allows uncertainty to exist inside a structured framework. Now, we arrive at one of the most misunderstood aspects of this entire topic: disclosure. People assume disclosure is an event, a moment where everything is revealed. But in reality, disclosure is a process, and more specifically, a controlled process. Information is released selectively, gradually, and strategically, not to provide answers, but to manage perception, because full transparency creates instability, and instability is something the system avoids at all costs. So instead, it gives just enough to acknowledge the problem, but not enough to resolve it. Now we return to something we've already seen, because alongside official channels, another force exists: whistleblowers, individuals who operate between the system and the public. They introduce claims, they challenge structure, and they force response. But the system doesn't respond with confirmation, and it doesn't respond with denial. It responds with something far more consistent: process, investigations, statements, reviews. And in doing so, it maintains control. Now, we look forward because the system has reopened the question, but it has not resolved it. And that tells us something important. The system is not trying to reach a final answer. It is trying to manage an ongoing condition, which means data will continue to be collected, analysis will continue to evolve, and conclusions will remain limited, because this may not be a single phenomenon. It may be multiple categories of the unknown, each requiring its own explanation. And that complexity means the question is unlikely to ever fully close again. Now, we connect everything, because this is not a new story, it is a repeating pattern. Blue Book, the system looked. Condon, the system closed the question. Reagan-era systems, the system expanded its capabilities. Grush, the system was challenged. UAP Return, the system reopened the question. This is not linear, it is cyclical. Investigate, close, evolve, reopen. And that cycle tells us something fundamental. The system is not designed to solve the unknown, it is designed to manage it. So, we step back one final time. We now have a system built to detect threats, technology capable of revealing anomalies, secrecy that limits understanding, and data that cannot be ignored. And from that combination, we get the modern UAP question. Not a question of belief, not a question of speculation, but a question of system behavior. UAP research did not return because the system changed its mind. It returned because the system could no longer ignore what it was seeing. Because in the end, this was never just about UFOs or aliens or even technology. It is a story about a system designed to protect itself from the unknown. And what happens when that system is forced to confront something it cannot fully understand. The question doesn't disappear. It doesn't resolve. It returns again and again and again. This is UFO to UAP, the Disclosure Report. I'm Matt Tones, and I'll leave you with one final thought. Sometimes the most important question is not what are we seeing, but why are we being forced to look again? Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, share the podcast, and don't forget to tell your mum about this episode.